The date is August 12th, 2008. A video camera is rolling somewhere in the disputed region of South Ossetia, capturing footage that will haunt international observers for years to come. In the frame, a young man in military fatigues stands among other soldiers. His name is Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev. He is 20 years old. Within hours of this footage being recorded, he will disappear completely. No body, no ransom demand, no communication. Just silence. And that silence has now stretched across more than 16 years. This is not a story about a soldier who died in combat and whose remains were lost in the chaos of war. This is a story about a man who was visibly, undeniably, alive on camera, and then erased from existence. The footage exists, the timestamp exists, the witnesses exist. But Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev does not. What happened in those hours between the camera shutting off and the world moving on? Where is he now? And why, despite international pressure, investigations, and the desperate pleas of a family that refuses to stop searching, has no one been held accountable for his disappearance? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the central wounds in a case that exposes the darkest machinery of modern conflict. The systematic disappearance of prisoners of war, the erasure of inconvenient evidence, and the weaponization of uncertainty against the families left behind. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, you have to understand who Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev was before he became a symbol, before he became a case file, before his face became frozen in that final piece of video footage. He was born on March 15, 1988, in the Republic of Ingushetia, a small federal subject in the North Caucasus region of Russia. Ingushetia is a place of stunning natural beauty. Mountain ranges, green valleys, ancient traditions, but also a place marked by conflict, displacement, and political tension. Growing up there meant growing up with an awareness of instability, of borders that shifted, of neighbors who became enemies, of wars that never quite ended. Khadzhi-Murat was the youngest of 3 siblings. His family described him as gentle, soft-spoken, and deeply loyal. He was not a natural soldier. He was not someone who grew up dreaming of military glory or thirsting for combat. He was a young man who loved his family, who helped his mother around the house, who spent time with friends in quiet, ordinary ways. He was planning to continue his education. He had dreams of building a stable, peaceful life. But in Russia, military service is compulsory for most young men. And in 2007, at the age of 19, Khadzhi-Murat was conscripted into the Russian armed forces. He did not resist. Like so many others, he accepted this as a duty, a rite of passage, something to endure and move past. He was assigned to a military unit, went through basic training, and adapted to the harsh realities of military life. Those who knew him during his service said he was disciplined, reliable, and non-confrontational. He kept his head down. He followed orders. He did not seek attention. He wrote letters home. He called when he could. He reassured his mother that he was safe, that the service was difficult but manageable, that he would return home soon. And then, in the summer of 2008, everything changed. To understand what happened to Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev, you must first understand the conflict that consumed him. South Ossetia is a region that most of the world had never heard of until August 2008. It is a small, landlocked territory in the South Caucasus, officially part of the country of Georgia, but claimed by ethnic Ossetians who sought independence or unification with North Ossetia, which is part of Russia. For decades, this territorial dispute simmered, sometimes erupting into violence, sometimes freezing into uneasy ceasefires, but never fully resolving. By 2008, the tensions had become unbearable. South Ossetia had been operating as a de facto independent state, with Russian support since the early 1990s. Georgia, meanwhile, was determined to reassert control over what it considered its sovereign territory. Both sides accused the other of provocations. Both sides prepared for war. On the night of August 7, 2008, Georgian forces launched a military offensive to retake South Ossetia. The operation began with artillery strikes on the regional capital, Tskhynvali. The goal, according to Georgian officials, was to restore constitutional order and protect Georgian civilians. But the timing and scale of the attack triggered an immediate and overwhelming response from Russia. Within hours, Russian military forces crossed the border into South Ossetia. Officially, Russia claimed it was acting to protect Russian peacekeepers stationed in the region and to defend South Ossetian civilians from Georgian aggression. But the operation quickly escalated into a full-scale invasion. Russian tanks rolled through Georgian territory. Russian aircraft bombed Georgian military installations deep inside Georgian borders. The conflict, which would later be known as the Russo-Georgian War, lasted only 5 days. But those 5 days were catastrophic. Thousands of people were killed. Tens of thousands were displaced. Cities were shelled. Villages were burned. And in the chaos, the fog of war descended over everything. This was not a clean, organized conflict with clear front lines and rules of engagement. This was a brutal, fast-moving clash where control of territory changed by the hour, where militias operated alongside regular forces, where prisoners were taken without process, and where documentation was an afterthought, if it existed at all. Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev was caught in the center of this storm. In the first week of August 2008, Khadzhi-Murat's military unit was stationed near the conflict zone. Exact details about his deployment are murky, intentionally so. The Russian military has never released comprehensive records of which units were sent where, which soldiers were involved in specific operations, or what orders were given. But what is known through family accounts and later investigations is that Khadzhi-Murat was aware that something significant was about to happen. He called home on August 5th, 2 days before the war began. His mother later recalled that he sounded tense but tried to reassure her. He told her not to worry. He said he would call again soon. He did not tell her where he was going or what his unit had been ordered to do. Perhaps he didn't know. Perhaps he wasn't allowed to say. Or perhaps he wanted to spare her the fear. That was the last time his family heard his voice. On August 7th, as Georgian forces launched their offensive, Russian units, including the one Khadzhi-Murat was part of, were mobilized and sent into South Ossetia. The operation happened quickly. Soldiers were given minimal preparation. Many, like Khadzhi-Murat, were young conscripts with limited combat experience. They were thrown into a fast-moving, chaotic situation where the lines between enemy combatants, civilians, and peacekeepers were blurred. Witnesses later reported seeing Russian convoys moving through mountain passes, soldiers setting up positions in hastily occupied villages, and confusion about command structures and objectives. The Russian military, despite its overwhelming force, was not operating with precision. Orders were contradictory. Communication was inconsistent, and in that confusion, individual soldiers could easily be lost, separated from their units, or captured without anyone immediately noticing. This is the nightmare scenario for any military family. The moment when your loved one steps into the fog and vanishes. The footage was captured on August 12, 2008, 5 days after the war began, and just 1 day before a ceasefire agreement was signed. The video shows a group of soldiers, some in Russian military uniforms, standing in what appears to be a rural area in South Ossetia. The camera pans across their faces. Some look exhausted, some look confused, some stare blankly at the ground. And then, for just a few seconds, the camera focuses on one young man. He is standing upright. His uniform is dirty but intact. His face is visible. His expression is unreadable, neither defiant nor afraid, just present, just there, alive. Later, analysis of the footage, combined with family identification and testimony from other soldiers who were present, confirmed that this young man was Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev. But here is where the story fractures into competing narratives, suppressed evidence, and deliberate obfuscation. According to some accounts, the soldiers in the video were Russian servicemen who had been separated from their main unit and were being temporarily held or processed by Georgian forces. According to other accounts, they were prisoners of war. According to still others, they were casualties being documented before transfer to medical facilities or repatriation. What is undisputed is that the footage exists, that Khadzhi-Murat is identifiable in it, and that this was the last confirmed sighting of him alive. What happened next is where the truth collapses into silence. The family first learned that something was wrong, not from official military channels, but from rumors. In the days following the ceasefire, Russian media began reporting that the war was over, that Russian forces had achieved their objectives, and that soldiers were returning home. Families across Russia waited anxiously for news of their sons, husbands, and brothers. Some received phone calls, some received letters. Some saw their loved ones walk through the door, exhausted but alive. Khadzhi-Murat's family received nothing. His mother, Raisa Yandieva, called the military unit where her son had been stationed. She was told there was no information. She called again. She was told to wait. She called a third time and was told that her son's status was under review. Under review. Not killed in action. Not wounded. Not captured. Under review. That phrase, bureaucratic, vague, evasive, would become the mantra of the Russian military establishment for years to come. It is a phrase designed to deflect responsibility, to delay accountability, and to exhaust the will of families who dare to demand answers. But Raisa Yandieva did not give up. She began making inquiries through every possible channel. She contacted human rights organizations. She reached out to other military families who had missing sons. She traveled to government offices. She filed formal requests for information. And, slowly, agonizingly, pieces of the story began to emerge. Someone had seen the video. Someone knew that Khadzhi-Murat had been captured. Someone knew that he was alive on August 12th, but no one would say what happened after that. When a soldier goes missing during wartime, there's supposed to be a process. There are international laws, conventions, and protocols designed to protect prisoners of war, to account for the missing, and to ensure that families receive answers. The Geneva Conventions, which govern the conduct of armed conflict, are explicit. Parties to a conflict must provide information about captured or deceased enemy combatants. Bodies must be returned. Graves must be marked. The missing must be accounted for. But in the chaos of the Russo-Georgian War and in the years that followed, these principles were systematically ignored. The Russian government initially refused to provide a list of soldiers who had been killed or captured during the conflict. Georgian authorities, for their part, claimed they had returned all prisoners of war and had no knowledge of any remaining detainees. Each side blamed the other. Each side pointed to the fog of war as an excuse, and in that mutual deflection, individuals like Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev were erased. Raisa Yandieva, however, refused to let her son be forgotten. She joined forces with other families of missing servicemen and began to organize. Together, they formed advocacy groups, held protests, and demanded that the Russian government conduct a real investigation. In response, the Russian military opened a case file. On paper, Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev was now officially listed as missing, but the investigation went nowhere. No witnesses were interviewed in any meaningful way. No forensic analysis of the video footage was conducted publicly. No diplomatic pressure was applied to Georgia to provide information about prisoners who may have been transferred, released, or held in secret detention. The investigation existed only as a formality, a checkbox on a bureaucratic form, not as a genuine effort to find the truth. Human rights organizations, including Memorial and the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers, took up the case. They compiled evidence, cross-referenced timelines, and identified inconsistencies in official statements. They pointed out that the Russian military had records of every soldier deployed to South Ossetia, that there were logs of casualties and transfers, and that the refusal to release this information was itself evidence of a cover-up. But the Russian government, particularly under the leadership of officials who saw the war as a strategic victory, had no interest in revealing uncomfortable truths about missing soldiers, captured men, or failures in command. And so the case remained open, technically under investigation, but in reality, frozen in deliberate inaction. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Russian state media portrayed the conflict as a decisive, heroic intervention to protect innocent civilians from Georgian aggression. Soldiers who died were honored as heroes. The war itself was framed as a moral necessity. But missing soldiers, soldiers who were captured, lost, or unaccounted for, did not fit into that narrative. They were complications. They raised questions about command failures, about the treatment of prisoners, about the chaos that the official story refused to acknowledge. As a result, cases like Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev's received very little coverage in mainstream Russian media. When they were mentioned at all, it was in brief, sanitized reports that emphasized the government's ongoing efforts to locate the missing, without ever acknowledging the systemic failures that made those efforts meaningless. But outside of state-controlled media, the story began to spread. Independent journalists, human rights activists, and international observers started to document the cases of missing soldiers from the Russo-Georgian War. They collected testimonies from families, analyzed available evidence, and published reports that contradicted the official narrative. They revealed that dozens, perhaps even hundreds of soldiers were unaccounted for, and that the Russian government was actively obstructing efforts to find them. Raisa Yandieva became one of the most vocal and visible advocates for these missing soldiers. She gave interviews. She held press conferences. She traveled to Moscow to demand meetings with government officials. She showed the video footage of her son to anyone who would watch. She refused to be silenced. Her advocacy was both powerful and heartbreaking. She was not a politician or an activist by training. She was a mother who had lost her son and who refused to accept the lie that he was simply gone, untraceable, a casualty of war whose fate could never be known. And the public, particularly other military families, responded. Protests were organized, petitions were signed, pressure was applied. But pressure, in an authoritarian system, only goes so far. The Russian government responded with token gestures, promises of renewed investigations, vague assurances that everything possible was being done. But no real action. And as the years passed and new conflicts emerged and public attention shifted, the case of Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev began to fade from the headlines. But his mother never stopped searching. More than 16 years after his disappearance, there is still no official answer to the question of what happened to Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev. But there are theories, some based on evidence, some based on patterns observed in similar cases, and some based on the grim logic of how prisoners of war are treated in conflicts where accountability is absent. This is the theory, most commonly suggested by Russian officials and military families. The argument is straightforward. Khadzhi-Murat was captured by Georgian forces on or shortly before August 12, 2008. The video footage shows him alive at that time, but his condition afterward is unknown. It is possible that he was injured, became ill, or died due to inadequate medical care or mistreatment while in detention. Georgian authorities, aware that holding or harming Russian prisoners of war would complicate post-war negotiations, may have disposed of his body without documentation and denied any knowledge of his death. Supporting evidence for this theory includes the fact that Georgian forces did take Russian prisoners during the conflict, and that some of these prisoners reported harsh conditions, inadequate food and water, and delays in medical treatment. There are also documented cases of prisoners who died in custody and whose deaths were not reported immediately. However, there are significant problems with this theory. First, Georgia has consistently denied holding any unaccounted-for Russian prisoners after the war. International observers, including the Red Cross, conducted inspections of detention facilities, and verified prisoner exchanges. While these processes were not perfect, they did involve documentation and oversight. If Khadzhi-Murat had died in Georgian custody, there should be a record, an unmarked grave, a transfer log, a witness statement, something. Second, the video footage itself raises questions. If Khadzhi-Murat was in Georgian custody, why was he being filmed? Who recorded the footage? Where was it originally broadcast or published? And why has that source never been identified or verified? The lack of clarity around the video suggests that the situation was more complicated than a straightforward capture and detention. The Russo-Georgian War was not fought solely by professional militaries. On both sides, irregular forces, militias, volunteer units, and paramilitary groups played significant roles. These groups operated with less oversight, less discipline, and less accountability than regular military units. It is possible that Khadzhi-Murat was captured not by Georgian regular forces, but by a militia or irregular unit operating in the chaos of the conflict. These groups were less likely to follow international law, less likely to document prisoners, and more likely to engage in summary executions or other war crimes. If Khadzhi-Murat was killed by such a group, his body may have been buried in an unmarked location or disposed of in a way that made identification impossible. The perpetrators, aware that their actions constituted war crimes, would have had every reason to destroy evidence and deny involvement. This theory is supported by reports from other families of missing soldiers, some of whom believe their loved ones were killed by militias operating outside the formal command structure. It is also consistent with the lack of official records. Irregular forces do not file paperwork or follow protocols. But this theory, too, has weaknesses. If Khadzhi-Murat was killed by irregulars, why was he being filmed beforehand, and why has no one, no defector, no witness, no whistleblower, come forward with information about what happened? This is the most painful theory, and the one that some families, including Khadzhi-Murat's, cling to with desperate hope. The idea is that Khadzhi-Murat was not killed, but instead transferred to a secret detention facility, either in Georgia, in a third country, or even back in Russian territory, under circumstances that were never officially documented. In this scenario, he would be a ghost prisoner, alive but invisible, existing in a bureaucratic void where no government acknowledges his presence. This theory may sound far-fetched, but it is not without precedent. There are documented cases from conflicts around the world where prisoners of war were held in secret detention for years, sometimes decades, without being officially acknowledged. Governments deny their existence. Families are told they are dead, and the prisoners themselves are used as leverage, as intelligence assets, or simply forgotten. Supporting this theory is the fact that the Russian government has never officially confirmed Khadzhi-Murat's death. He is listed as missing, not deceased, and in some cases missing persons from the Russo-Georgian War have resurfaced years later, sometimes released in prisoner swaps, sometimes discovered in detention facilities that were never officially acknowledged. But the evidence for this theory is thin. If Khadzhi-Murat were alive, someone would know. Someone would have seen him. Someone would have records. And after 16 years, the likelihood of a secret detention scenario becomes increasingly implausible. This is the theory that human rights organizations find most compelling, and the one that the Russian government refuses to address. The argument is this: Khadzhi-Murat was not captured by Georgian forces at all. He was killed, either in combat, in an accident, or as a result of command negligence, while under Russian military control. The video footage, rather than showing him in enemy hands, actually shows him shortly before his death, possibly during a chaotic retreat or evacuation. The Russian military, aware that his death would raise uncomfortable questions about the competence of commanders, the safety of conscripts, the chaos of the operation, decided to classify his status as missing rather than killed in action. This allowed them to avoid scrutiny. avoid compensation claims from the family, and avoid admitting that the war was far messier and more costly than the official narrative suggested. This theory is supported by a disturbing pattern. Many families of soldiers who were initially listed as missing later discovered that their loved ones had actually been killed and that the military had known about their deaths but had deliberately withheld the information. In some cases, bodies were eventually returned years later, with no explanation for the delay. In other cases, families were simply told that new information had come to light with no accountability for the years of lies. If this theory is correct, then Khadzhi-Murat's body may be in a Russian military morgue, or buried in an unmarked grave, or misidentified in a mass casualty log. The video footage would be irrelevant, a distraction, a coincidence, or a deliberate piece of misdirection. But proving this theory requires access to military records that the Russian government refuses to release. There are certain aspects of this case that haunt anyone who examines it closely. These are the details that don't fit neatly into any theory, the inconsistencies that suggest something deeper and more troubling than a simple wartime tragedy. Who recorded it? Where was it first published? Why has the original source never been verified? And most disturbingly, why does the footage show Khadzhi-Murat looking relatively unharmed, while other accounts suggest chaos and violence? If he was in Georgian custody, why was he being filmed in such a calm, almost documentary-like manner? In any group of soldiers, there are witnesses, people who were there, people who saw what happened, people who know the truth. But in Khadzhi-Murat's case, no one has come forward. Not a single fellow soldier has provided a detailed account of his capture, his condition, or his fate. This silence is either the result of fear, coercion, or the possibility that those who knew the truth are also dead or missing. The Russian military has comprehensive records of every soldier deployed to South Ossetia. They have logs of casualties, transfers, medical evacuations, and prisoner exchanges. The refusal to release these records, or even to confirm basic facts about Khadzhi-Murat's deployment, is not the result of bureaucratic inefficiency. It is a deliberate policy of obstruction. Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev is not the only soldier who went missing during the Russo-Georgian War. There are dozens of similar cases. Young men who were confirmed alive at some point during the conflict, and who then vanished without explanation. The fact that so many cases remain unresolved suggests a systemic problem, not a series of isolated tragedies. As of today, more than 16 years after his disappearance, Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev is still officially listed as missing. His case file remains open. His mother continues to advocate for answers. In 2010, 2 years after the war, Georgia and Russia conducted a prisoner exchange that was supposed to resolve outstanding cases of missing persons. Russian officials announced that all prisoners of war had been returned. Georgian officials made similar claims, but Khadzhi-Murat was not among those returned. In 2015, new DNA identification technologies were applied to unidentified remains recovered from the conflict zone. Families of missing soldiers were asked to provide DNA samples in the hope that their loved ones could finally be identified and laid to rest. Raisa Yandieva provided a sample. No match was found. In 2018, on the 10-year anniversary of the war, human rights organizations published reports documenting the cases of soldiers who were still missing. Khadzhi-Murat's case was featured prominently. The report called on the Russian government to declassify military records, to conduct independent forensic investigations, and to provide families with the truth. The government did not respond. In 2020, Raisa Yandieva filed a lawsuit against the Russian Ministry of Defense, demanding that they release all records related to her son's deployment, capture, and disappearance. The lawsuit was dismissed on procedural grounds. An appeal was denied. Today, the case is no closer to resolution than it was in 2008. The investigation is technically ongoing, but no investigator is actively working on it. The file sits in an archive somewhere, gathering dust, a monument to bureaucratic indifference and institutional complicity. And yet, the family has not given up. Raisa continues to attend commemorations for missing soldiers. She continues to speak to journalists. She continues to hold the photograph of her son and insist, with quiet, unbreakable determination, that he deserves to be found. There are moments in this story that feel almost unbearable in their injustice. A young man, 20 years old, doing his compulsory service, caught in a war he did not start and could not escape. A piece of video footage, clear and undeniable, showing him alive. A family waiting by the phone, hoping for news that will never come. And a government, with all its resources and power, choosing silence over truth. Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev is not just missing. He has been disappeared, deliberately, systematically, as part of a machinery that values state narratives over individual lives. The central question is not whether we will ever know what happened to him. The central question is why, when the evidence exists, when the witnesses exist, when the records exist, no one with the power to reveal the truth is willing to do so. This is a story about a soldier who vanished after being captured on camera. But it is also a story about how easy it is to erase a person when institutions decide that the truth is inconvenient. Khadzhi-Murat Yandiyev was real. He was loved. He mattered. And somewhere, someone knows what happened to him.